question, is how often should I rotate comb in my hive? Or if I've got really old dark comb, should I get rid of it? And that's a challenging question. So dark comb is not a bad thing. And it's amazing how quickly comb does get dark in a hive. I mean, that first year, when your bees first draw out beeswax, it's that beautiful white, yellow. And by the end of the season, it's dark. And there's a couple reasons that happens. It's because the bees are walking all over it all the time. They're tracking in little bits of debris, and that darkens it. And then every time brood hatches out of a cell, they leave a very, very thin layer of a cocoon on the outer walls of that cell after they hatch, and that darkens the frame and the comb. So, it's perfectly natural and perfectly okay for that comb to darken. The reason we eventually rotate out and dispose of those really old dark frames, two primary reasons. One is that comb and well, beeswax in general absorbs chemicals. And it can absorb chemicals from mite treatments that you put in the hive. It can absorb chemicals from the environment outside the hive and the bees bring into the hive inadvertently. And over time, years, you can have increasingly high levels of chemicals essentially absorbed into your beeswax. And that can eventually, potentially, depending on the chemicals and the load of them, it can eventually begin to harm the developing bees and the bees themselves. So the other big argument for rotating comb is that, if you've ever seen a 20-year-old frame, it is heavy. It's just the cells have gotten really small as they got hundreds and hundreds of layers of those cocoons stuck on the inside. That cell gets smaller and smaller, and they just get really heavy from all that debris, all those cocoons, the bees adding and repairing wax over time. And then often as frame gets damaged or wax honeycomb gets damaged, the bees will often draw it back out as drone cells. And so you can see some really old 20, 30-year-old frames that are almost all drone cells at some point, because the bees often will go back and repair it with drone cells sized rather than worker bee cell size. So that gives you a little bit of background on it. But in a nutshell, I usually recommend about every 5 years would be a little aggressive, a little too soon. 10 years might be a little bit long, depending on the environment that your bees are in. If you're routinely keeping bees in a monoculture environment where you've got tons of corn and wheat, and the bees are foraging on soybeans or sunflowers frequently that are being sprayed, and they're always bringing some of that back to the hive inadvertently, you might want to do it at 7 or 8 years. If you're in a pretty rural area with not a lot of that going on, you could probably be fine at 10 years. But I would say 10 years is a decent, it's a decent time frame to shoot towards. If a frame breaks, and it's already at year 6 or 7, instead of repairing it, I would just call it out and get rid of it. And so, doing it every 5 years isn't going to hurt anything. It might just be more money than you want to spend over time. The best way I found to call out frames, because I don't want to get a frame full of brood and throw it away. That's a huge wasted resource on the bees. What I try to do is, as frames start getting older, I start moving them towards the outside of the box. So if I've got a frame that's really old and I want to get rid of it within the next year or two, and it's in the middle of my hive, well, every time I go do an inspection once a month, I might just move it one frame closer to the outside of the box. And then the next time, one frame closer. And eventually, by doing that, you're going to have that frame on the far outside edge of the box. And then in the late winter, the bees will oftentimes have eaten all the resources from the outer edges of those frames. And then you can pull that empty frame out, burn it, and replace it with a new fresh one. So, you know, kind of getting on that rotation process and keeping those older frames moving towards the outside is a great way to replace old damaged combs or just old combs in general.